item on the agenda are public appearances, but we have none this evening. Might be a first.
Surprise.
No news is good news, right? Second item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve minutes.
Okay, a second? Seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Laura, your advisory vote?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, minutes pass unanimously. So I'm going to ask whether there is a motion to move our agenda items and move up the employee handbook update to be our next agenda item, so that people visiting us today, coming to the meeting, don't need to sit through the budget discussion
Moved.
before that.
Second.
Laura, your advisory vote?
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That passes. So the next item on our agenda is the employee handbook update. Jen, do I turn that over to you?
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Excellent.
Heidi is here, as well as Deirdre. We're going to make this short and sweet. Just a few quick little updates. You all have seen the memo and read it, so we'll just highlight a few things. We want to point out specifically where we addressed some of the items that the board had asked us to address on the front end. We'll make sure to address those and then take your questions. So Heidi, I'll pass it over to you.
Think it's on? It's on. So, you know, Jen sent you a memo and it shows that we've agreed, the review committee reached consensus on a variety of items regarding benefits, teachers, the EAs, sub-teachers, and the custodial food service units. Couple things we did want to point out was the board had asked us to look at providing some kind of rubric around when the quote other unpaid leaves would be granted, and we did reach consensus on that item, which is covered under the benefits section. A couple of the other items you were looking at us to address, it was brought up, you know, high school class size or, you know, sections, but what we really ended up focusing on more was the planning time at the secondary level. We weren't able to reach consensus on language items, but we agreed that it is an important issue that we still need to address, so we're going to continue our work in that area. Another area was regarding the co-curricular portion of the handbook, which is somewhat out of date. We looked at that as kind of a longer range project because we needed a lot more background information to be able to really address it, and we're going to continue to look at that. We're kind of dividing it between the athletic piece and the other co-curricular piece, and we'll be starting that work in the spring. The other really big items that you had listed all revolved around the compensation piece, and so you will be getting that information when you get the budget information in March. So any questions for us?
TJ?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what is the current language of the high school workload, and will that be carried over? And how does that interact with the recently revised class size policy?
I would say there's
That's kind of three questions.
Okay.
I think it's all the same topic.
Right. The class or the workload language will stay the same, and it's currently 25 hours of instruction per week at the secondary level. That's the workload language, stays the same. Class size language, we made a couple modifications to provide the ability for people with class size concerns to raise those within the building, but the class size language it feeds off of the board policy, so that, you know, informs what class size is, like it used to.
Does the current language have a hours of instruction and number of students, or is there no number of students?
The language on the workload is the hours of
And
instruction.
there is no,
But there is class size language, which basically it's mirroring what the board policy is.
Thank you.
Nikki? And then me?
If this is off topic, please tell me. But was there anything discussed about new teachers who have gotten a licensure through the private corporations and have not done the student teaching? Was that addressed?
No.
Didn't know.
Dean?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I'm 100% clear on the custodial food service last bullet. The inquiries we got were in support of this, and I want to make sure that this means that if someone was hired from another department and transferred over, that they were getting credit for all the time worked in the other department. Is that
Okay.
what we were trying to address here?
Right, that's what the language means. And normally the language, when you adopt it, it's applied prospectively. What we were looking at is saying, okay, for if we had people who transferred into these units since the handbook came into being, we would apply that to those people as well.
Can we do that proactively then too, if that
Right,
happened?
it would go prospectively. You know, we wouldn't do it retroactively, but it would apply to those people prospectively. But it wouldn't apply to people who, 5 years ago under the CBAs transferred in. Do you understand what we mean by that?
Well, not that last part, no.
Okay.
That's a whole new thing that, I think the logic is that if someone was working in this department and then switched over to another department, we weren't starting them over as a brand-new employee. Didn't they continue to get credit for where they were working here?
No. Their CBAs did not contain a provision that provided for that.
Really?
Correct.
And now that's gone, we don't have that anymore.
Correct. So now we have the handbook, and we have now added that provision to the handbook for those units as well.
So if someone was a custodial worker and then went to a SEA, for example, two completely different departments, they're still working for MMSD and they still get all the longevity benefit, right?
Right, now under this language that we added. See, in the past, there was only that language in the MTI units, but not in the AFSCME units.
Okay, I get it.
Nikki and then TJ.
How far retroactively do we go back?
We're looking at going back to when the handbook, so that was 16, 17. 2 years.
And this is in relation to both pay and longevity, or is it?
It's regard to, longevity is pay. So it's regard to longevity and vacation.
Longevity and vacation. Can we get a cost estimate for how much it would be to grandfather all our employees who would fall under this, just all the way back to
To when?
1800?
Yeah.
We can try. I
Or
mean,
to anyone that,
it may-
anyone that didn't get the credit, that was,
I mean,
somehow.
this
that-
may be 6 employees, it may
Yeah.
be 60, and
Yep. Yep.
I
Yeah.
think that makes a difference.
Sure.
Um,
Anna?
Yeah, I agree. I would like to get a cost moving back to see how we could do that retroactively. My other question is in regard, I think the last time we had a discussion around the custodial staff, we had talked about like a training ladder and really putting together a comprehensive way to move people up the ranks and to receive the proper certification and training they needed to move into higher position jobs. Where are we at with that? Has that been done? Are we still working on that?
I know that they do have training in place that hasn't been before, that they have put together, at least, last summer, and I know the summer before, they put together some comprehensive training. Is it still a work in progress? I believe so.
And we can provide an update for you on that. I think it's an important topic, and I know Chad and the team have been trying to make some significant strides.
Kate?
I was just going to ask, what's the process and timeline for reaching consensus on the areas that we weren't able to this time around?
We don't have a specific timeline in place to, are there topics that we are going to continue to address? Yes. We plan on, at our next meeting in March, actually putting together a timeline for changes in the handbook and having it be a little more concrete so that we can back map, from where do we want to have it done, and then we'll back map our meetings from there.
Yeah, and I'll just to make a statement about the process. I think the team's been working pretty well together, and we're learning about how this handbook process ought to work every year. And when I say the team, I mean the joint team. And I think what we've committed to in the handbook process as approved by the board is that at least annually, we're engaging and coming back with possible changes. So I think we would be targeting the next year's handbook changes. But I think we're learning each year about how to make sure that this process is working for us and that we're starting the process early enough that we can get through some of the issues that may be more complex. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add to that is through the feedback last year, it was really evident that we needed to pull together subgroup work groups to work on this so that we weren't having folks that were looking at the months of summer and really trying to jam all of this work in, but having a thoughtful process where work groups came together. It was an opportunity to do the research that we needed to do, data collection, et cetera. So the intent is to have work groups working throughout the year to really dig into these topics and then use the annual review process to bring those changes forward.
TJ?
I'm a little confused on where the planning time sits now. You had language around the planning time there. The memo we received from MTI this week said that this was not language that this is not the language they desired. Is that something that will be continued to be discussed among, or is the language before us the final language?
There's no language, TJ. It just goes back to the status quo. Yeah.
So I guess that my question is that will the joint committee be continuing to discuss planning time, or is that in your head settled with the language that was before us tonight?
We are going to continue to discuss the planning time issue. It's just not part of the recommendations for this upcoming changes to the handbook.
Point being,
so the handbook we will be asked to approve sometime in the next, next month, or the next weeks?
this month, yep.
Will include the language you sent us tonight. And if a board member would desire to have the language that MTI wants at this point, is there a way to accomplish that?
Yeah, you could choose to disagree with the superintendent's recommendation and impose new language in the handbook.
And that would be done at the time we would be...
Is that not true?
I'm trying to get the process here.
Just process-wise.
I'm trying to understand the process because we had confusion in the past about the process. So, and that would be done at, yeah, when would that be done? When would an amendment of that sort be offered? At the board meeting, at the regular board meeting?
I would say yes.
Okay. And there will be no, and if that were to happen, it would be no, this is coming to us at the last minute, we can't consider it, and that this is the wrong process, because often people say that that's the wrong process. That's why I'm asking now what the process is. All right.
I feel like
That's
I need
fine.
to revisit the document. I mean, we have this process in writing and it's board approved. So I don't have it in front of me right now, but maybe you can pull it up, Heidi. Yeah. So should we pause and take a quick look at the process so you can remember?
Or we can get this information later. I just.
Well, why don't we
I mean,
do this
that's
to
fine.
keep this moving, is
That's
that
fine.
while Heidi looks at that, are there any other questions that anyone has? Okay, then we'll wait for the response on the process, and then we will move on to the next item.
I mean, if I maybe just ask you a question, if there's areas that you're thinking of, can we get some more color and context around what the, where everybody is at and what the outstanding issues are? Is that?
Yeah.
Just
I mean, you
that's-
guys.
Well, I guess I don't,
I think Kate is
Around planning
asking
time in
why were we
particular,
not
right?
able to come to consensus
planning time.
on planning time, and why did we?
Yeah, what's the,
Yeah.
did you just share, just give some color around what the,
there is, you know, at the secondary level, there has never been a specific language saying there's X amount of individual planning time. It hasn't been, you know, that has not been included in that. So there was a discussion around wanting some of that language. Then coming down to we couldn't reach consensus on what is that exact number going to be? Is it going to be 10 periods? a week? Is it between 7 periods a week, 8, 9, 10? Are you looking at class periods? Are you looking at hours? Because at the secondary level, if you said hours, not none of them have a class period that's an hour. Some are 53 minutes, some are 52 minutes. So it was discussion around having flexibility for, principals to call meetings when they needed to versus having everything be totally dedicated to individual planning time. And it was clear that maybe there were some schools where there were real concerns about how principals were using time during the week, and others where it didn't seem to be as big of a concern. So when we couldn't reach agreement around an actual specific number that may be applicable across the board to everybody, we discussed about, well, let's look at schools individually and see those schools where there really are some concerns. Let's start addressing that, because there were other schools where they really, weren't having those same concerns.
And just, Heidi, just to clarify also, I think what I understood in kind of the updates and briefing is that there was also some concern around specifically codifying how much time, because there were some schools that were getting more than what was being proposed. And so if we're putting parameters on exact amounts, it ends up creating a challenge for those schools that have a higher level of flexibility. So not really wanting to land on a particular number per se, and force other schools to have to abide by that if they were being more flexible with that time.
Mm-hmm. Is that
right? Because you're going to have some people, I think, who would have looked at that as a negative when that was not the intent.
Yeah. So
Dean?
Yeah, quickly, I think what TJ was trying to get at is that when approval or when amendments or changes get brought to our monthly big board meeting, often many of us don't feel that it was sufficient enough to really make a good decision. So I think were you planning on making a specific amendment now, and was it about planning?
At this time, I actually don't know. I'd like to, and I appreciate Kate's question about the planning time, to hear a little bit more about that. That became aware of the differences of around this from Doug's memo today, and kind of just getting a feel for the issue. And it's been before us before, but get a feel for where we're at now. So honestly, I don't know, Dean. I would like to talk more with your people at the table and the people who are at the table from our bargaining units, and particularly talk to, whether they were at the table or not, some of our high school and middle school teachers to find out how this is working for them. And I honestly don't know, Dean.
Okay. Well,
So, excuse me, Jen would like to say something.
Thanks, Mary. I want to reiterate that this is the way I'm experiencing our work with MTI on the issue of planning time. I don't see us in conflict. We want to figure out how best to lay out the parameters for secondary planning time. Right now, it's silent. That doesn't mean that we're telling the secondary teachers that can only have a certain amount. It actually, the issue is it's silent on it. So I want to reiterate that we just need more time to work this out. We are very much committed to making sure that our teachers have sufficient planning time. I'd love the board to trust that the committee can do its work, which has representative teachers on it, which has representative administrators that are working diligently at figuring out the right solution. We just haven't gotten there yet. But we have gotten there on a lot of other issues, and we don't want to hold up the rest of the handbook decision-making because of this singular topic. No, we don't have a specific timeline for when we're going to bring it back, but we're all committed to continuing the conversation. I'm just worried that we're making it seem as if we are at odds, and that the administrative team is digging in their heels. It's just that the language is silent at the secondary level. And, yeah, I just want to reiterate, we'd very much like the board to trust that this process, that this committee, which is all about collaborative work and problem solving, can come to agreement. That is the work that we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and
together.
I think I would just add to that, obviously, through the revision process, we always have the ability to put forth language. Jen can make a decision if she wants to put forth that language for approval. And with this particular language specifically, we chose not to do that because we want to continue to try to work collaboratively and find some consensus language that everyone can agree upon. So I just think it's important to know that.
Anna?
Yeah, one suggestion, and maybe you're already doing this, I'm looking at your different work groups that you have set up. Has there been any consideration of doing like a related arts work group? Because I feel like some of these things, especially around like the planning time and that type of stuff, is going to be experienced very different with the related arts staff, and I don't know how much their voice is being included in the discussion.
And with regard to the planning, there is a related arts group, but it's speaking more towards things that definitely deal with the arts, not as much the planning time piece, just so that you
We did find
fit the language.
Okay.
Okay, so basically it says that a review committee comprised of 8 district and 8 employee representatives will meet to review the proposed handbook revisions. The employee groups are listed, and everybody determines their own representatives. The review committee will meet each year as needed to review the various proposed revisions in an attempt to reach a consensus on the changes, deletions, and additions to the handbook. Revisions on which the review committee can reach consensus will be forwarded by the superintendent to the board for final approval. On any area where a consensus is not reached, the superintendent shall make a determination and a recommendation to the board for final approval.
So there is no opportunity to,
I'm just checking one other thing.
I know there was discussion
there was
about
discussion in the past.
I know.
in the past, and it was the board deliberated on changes to this particular language.
No, actually,
and-
we didn't. We weren't allowed to because that was changing it, and we were told that we weren't allowed to amend it. And so we couldn't change it because that would be amending something that we didn't have the power to amend. We did change the process to have a front-loaded part where the board was identifying topics.
Right.
But in terms of, it comes to us as a yes or no still. And as long as we are not given language by the superintendent that allows us to amend it, we are not allowed to amend it. And that was the interpretation last time. And apparently that's the interpretation still. Which I find very disturbing understanding of the powers of the board in relation to the administration.
You guys, this is your thing to discuss. If you want to agendize a discussion on changing the language of this particular section of the handbook, this is precise. I want to go back actually to the minutes of that particular meeting, and I will, because this is not me trying to hold on to power. This is the reason the language looks the way that it does is because there was a commitment to making sure that the power was with the committee. And that's why the board kind of coming in on the back end of the process and proposing language that has not been fully considered by the committee, right, is problematic because it takes power away from the committee. If you guys are comfortable with changing the process so that the power isn't with the committee, then that's not something I would recommend, but that's certainly a discussion you can have with the board.
And
James.
excuse me, when we did revise the policy to add the front loading, where we would come to you, and it also, there was a provision added that the board can also forward to the review committee for discussion proposed revisions under sections of the handbook to consider.
James?
Yeah, we did.
Which didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, we had this conversation last year, and I thought we made the correction, and I thought we were able to, but so the issue now is that we're not happy with the correction we made because we weren't able to get input up front. And I think we changed the policy so that we could make that input. So,
Right.
and I'm not saying what we should or should not do at this point. So are you suggesting that we need to revisit it again and make some, so we're not happy with the revisions we made last time?
But first, let me say that this was not something I was thinking about or planning on when I came
Yeah.
in tonight, so some of this is trying to refresh my memory and do things like that. And particularly around the planning time and that. I think that the front-loading piece has worked well, and I'm glad we did that. There is an issue that is, it's kind of a two-piece issue. One is the language that's in the handbook itself about the amendment process, and the other is a generalized understanding of the power of the Board of Education. And it is my generalized understanding of the power of the Board of Education that we cannot delegate to anyone the power to tell us what our power is. And that is the current interpretation of how the handbook approval process works, is that we are told that there is a limitation on our power, and there's a power that we have given away. I don't think we can do that. I mean, I don't think as an elected body, I don't think we can delegate in that manner. So that's the big picture. And the second is that the language of the handbook is, yes, I do think that it should be revisited in general, because I do think that when something like this has been, we talked about the planning time, this is, I understand you've been working hard on this, but we are 2 or 3 years into the handbook process, and we don't have secondary planning time solved. And we have... What's that?
Yeah. So I'm going to jump in, and then it's Kate, and then it's Nikki. And TJ, I do not interpret it at all that way. I don't think the board is deciding that somehow we are undermining our own power. I think we have decided, and what we have endorsed is a process. And in that process, it lays out how the board votes. It still comes to us for a vote, so we can vote it up or we can vote it down. We haven't given away our power. I think what we're trying to do in this, and I remember this discussion last year, is that this, if we're giving the power to come to a consensus and negotiate or discuss through that, and enable the committee to do that. I think it's a process that has worked well. It doesn't mean that everything has always come to a consensus, especially quickly. But the minute that we insert ourselves into it is the minute that I think we undermine the process and the power that the committee has to work through these issues and come to agreements and ways of working that really overall are as close to a consensus as we can get. And I think that's what we need in our schools, where we have very close alignment between the administration and our staff to come to solutions. And I would not be in favor of changing that because for the reasons that I had indicated. Kate?
So I think similar. There's huge value to me in the fact that Doug and Andy in particular have led a process with a broad set of people. I mean, I appreciate your note letting us know that over 50 people, MTI members, have participated in the process, right? I just think better decisions are going to get made if we're not making them, if folks closer to the work are making them. So I would like, though, maybe to ask for more clarity on the timeline to keep working on the issues that we haven't come to consensus on, and that maybe setting a goal for us to talk about that before 12 months from now could be a way forward. So I think this is good work. I'm glad we've done it. We haven't done it all. Let's keep working it and get a timeline for when we can re-engage before a year from now. If that's the way forward here.
Nikki?
Sorry for the history lesson, the legal history lesson, but you're going to get a very short one. Marbury versus Madison, you have no right without a remedy. Very simply, everyone is allowed a remedy and it's the purpose of having rights and being able to, by not being able to amend, by not being able to go back, we truly don't have a remedy because we could only front load it. We cannot go and address the entire thing. Therefore, based on the issue of precedent, as much as I respect the board, as much as I respect everyone's work, I would be very open to reopening it for that reason.
So that actually isn't the agenda topic, so that will need to be added to the board agenda, and that goes to, exactly. So on this particular subject, so as it stands, that is the process and the policy that is in place until it is brought to the board. So are there any more questions or topics with regards to the handbook decision and what's being proposed? Okay.
All right. Thank
Good.
you, Heidi.
Thank you, Heidi.
Deirdre. And thank you to everyone who's helped with this process.
You did very well. Thank you.
So then we are on to the budget update, and Mike is.
Yeah, we've got Mike, Lisa, and Deirdre, the budget team. All right. Thanks, guys. All right, we'll go ahead and let Mike just take it away. That's all right.
Okay. This is largely an informational reason tonight. We're reporting out on recent progress in developing next year's budget, seeking board's input, questions, insights, observations, as per usual. The goal here is that we want to arrive at the April preliminary budget presentation with a product that meets your expectations. So these monthly check-ins are a great way to do that. So we're going to tag team this presentation, Lisa and I, as per usual, Deirdre as well. There's a point at which this process turns more towards HR, and we'll point that out as we when we get there. Okay? So we've got about 15 minutes worth of material, most, and we'll see how this goes. This slide is not in your packet. It occurred to us over the weekend that this might help organize the discussion, not just tonight, but going forward. This is our high-level budget timeline. We got into this work back in November. The board passed a class size policy in December that was really key for us. Last month, we talked to you about our budget goals, guiding principles, enrollment projection, did a budget overview. Tonight, kind of a revised budget overview and school staffing. And then the next couple of months are all about priority actions, compensation, benefits, and so on. And it will arrive at April. So for this presentation, we have an exciting double feature for you tonight. First, we're going to update the high-level budget strategy. And this is our first take, really, on the independent charter schools that have been winding their way through the approval process, through the UW system. And then secondly, and this is really traditionally February, when we do the staffing summary for the schools. Okay? So let's take a look at the high-level budget strategy. We used this pie chart or something very similar to it last month. We're showing it to you again here tonight, really as sort of a baseline scenario. I really want to use this to compare the updated one, which you'll see in a minute. This pie chart had a placeholder in it for our sort of traditional compensation strategy, an additional compensation strategy, a benefits placeholder, priority actions, etc. And that's not the final word on this by any means. It's really kind of our high-level modeling as of January. Some of the key parameters for budget design for next year: level enrollment, actually slightly declining. I think it's projected to be down about 45 students level total staffing, and you'll see that later. A narrowing of priority actions down to just the really key items. Narrowing both in terms of scope and cost. Compensation will be the topic for both March and April. And in this scenario, we were using $5 million of the board's $8 million of local levy authority. We wanted to bring in a budget model that contained a tax increase of 4% or less, and then let the board work on what the unfinished business might be in that budget, whether it's around a priority action or a comp or what have you. And to the extent that you needed to adjust the tax levy up or down, that would be your option. And so that's how things stood as of just last month. So the new aspect to the 18-19 MMSD budget is the emergence of the independent charter schools. And let me take a minute here just to kind of go through some of the basics. They are called 2X charter schools, and we'll get to that in a second. These are authorized not by our board, but by the UW System Office of Educational Opportunity. We use the term 2X. It is actually the statutory reference. It's kind of shorthand. If you look in the state statutes under subparagraph 2, subparagraph X, you'll get to this area. So 2X is just a statutory reference. These schools are non-instrumentality schools. They are not instruments of this unit of government. They're independent of MMSD. And the employees of that or of those 2X charter schools would not be employees of MMSD. And then lastly, the UW System Office of Educational Opportunity reported publicly about 3 weeks ago that they were in the process of authorizing the first two independent charter schools in Madison beginning next school year. Those are Isthmus Montessori. Oh, okay, I can gather myself and carry on. The two independent charters are Isthmus Montessori and One City. Approximately, based on their representations to UW, approximately 275 students. So since this is our first conversation about this, I thought maybe I could add a little bit more perspective. Essentially, the perspective I want to add is budgetary. There are a lot of different perspectives on this. They're really not for tonight. There's a public policy perspective on it. There's an instructional perspective. There's a sort of a communitarian neighborhood school perspective. Really not where I want to go with this. So it's not that I don't appreciate those conversations. They are important. For tonight, my job is really just to get the basic budgetary impact out on the table to the extent that I can. And I should say that it's very early in this process. There are a lot of key data points that we're going to need that we don't have yet, mostly around the enrollment at these 2X charter schools for this coming fall. How many students actually will be enrolled? It's one thing to represent your goal. It's a different thing to actually enroll those students. How many will be 4K, which is prorated, right? 4K is like a half-time program. How many will be MMSD residents? If a student attends a 2X that is from Middleton, that's basically Middleton's issue, not ours. How many of these students would be new to the MMSD enrollment count and revenue limit calculation? These are all facts that we don't have yet. We feel obligated to kind of try to size it up just for budget planning purposes, but don't take that, don't assign any more weight to that than is necessary at this point, because we just don't have that much information. So let me give you a couple of the budgetary basics on this. Students who are enrolled in the 2X charters are added to the MMSD enrollment count for purposes of calculating our revenue limit. That's been reported a couple of different ways in the local press and not always exactly on point. There's the older charters have a different system. These are newer charters. But the key is for us is that these students would essentially be added to our revenue limit count. That brings a certain amount of revenue authority with it. On the expenditure side, MMSD will be charged, if you will, right, by the state an amount of approximately $8,500 per student. I say approximately because it's indexed, and we don't know exactly what the indexing is for next year. $8,500 per student, or for full-time student, for each student attending the 2X charter. So at $8,500 a student, times 100 or 200 or 300 or 400 students, you can see this is an item of some importance in the overall budget. So I want to carry this one step further, and then I don't want to go that far into the accounting weeds, but just I think one level further just to get it out there. There are really two types of, or two categories, if you will, of enrollment and how that enrollment affects MMSD. So the first would be a student who is not enrolled in MMSD this year, not enrolled this year with us, but then does attend a 2X charter next year. Okay, so that might be a student who's currently at IMA, right, paying private tuition. It could be somebody at one of the other private Montessoris in town who wants to attend this public Montessori. It could be a parochial school student. Right? The challenge in this particular case is that it's really all about our tax levy. You're essentially adding public school students out of what once were private school students, and the cost of that will be borne by the MMSD taxpayer because it's built into our revenue limit and our taxing authority. Right? That's one type. That's the new to the enrollment count type of student. The other is the student who is already enrolled in MMSD this year, one of our school students, who chooses to enroll in a 2X charter next year. That's sometimes called the vacuum effect or the transfer effect. It's a different type of challenge. In this case, the challenge is not about the tax levy per se. It's really about us managing the cost reductions or cost offsets to balance our budget. Right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So, I'm sorry?
So basically, if they transfer, then we also pay both. We pay both, but one is out of our tax levy and one isn't.
So, it's a little thought experiment here. If you had a couple hundred students leave MMSD and go to the 2X charter, they're currently in MMSD's count, and they would be next year. So the increase in district revenue due to enrollment is zero. On the expenditure side, the first challenge is you're going to pay $8,500 per student. The second challenge is, okay, you'll have less students. In theory, you should be able to pull cost out of your system because you'll have fewer students. However, if that cost is scattered or diffused across the whole city, a couple students here, a couple of students there, it's going to be very difficult for us to pull staff or other types of cost in tandem with the $8,500 per pupil. In fact, I think we're going to be chasing that number for quite a while. I'll pause there. Are there questions?
Teacher.
Number one is that in that 85,000, just this is a
8,500.
question. This is a question. That 8,500 comes off the top of equalization aid. Does it not?
That is the mechanism by which.
So, and essentially that an equalization aid is something around $2,000 per student. So in effect, we're going to have a reduction of equalization aid per student greater than we receive from the state, which will be the shift to the local taxpayers for that.
Yes, more or less, yes. Yes, we don't physically write a check to the 2X charter.
It comes off the top.
The state takes away some of our equalization aid and uses that money to send to the 2X charter.
Second question is something that people have been asking about, which is that does will the district have any responsibility for transportation, for special education costs, for bilingual costs that will be incurred at the 2X charters that are beyond? You know, if there's a student with an IEP who has needs that can they come to us and ask us to fulfill those needs? And if there's transportation,
so ask. Of course, they can ask.
They can ask.
But the question, I
We
think
have
the
an
question you're asking
Mm-hmm.
is, do we have a legal obligation? And I want to hedge this and say I've done my research, which tells me that this is an independent public school.
and
Independent
that's my
in the
research
same
says that
sense
too.
that Verona is independent,
Mm-hmm.
or Sun Prairie is independent. So our obligations would not extend to providing transportation or related services. That is my understanding. I want to leave 1% wiggle room in case I need to amend that, but that's what we understand today. Is that,
Matt's shaking his head.
I believe, I agree with that understanding. Matt's nodding his head.
Okay,
It's
thank
something
you.
that a lot of people have been asking in the
Yeah.
community, which is why I wanted it on the table here today.
Right.
And the final thing is, and this I have no idea, is there a deadline by which they must complete their enrollment, or can they go up to September and keep adding students to the third Friday count, and then we won't know what those numbers are till the third Friday count? Does anyone know that?
I do not have an answer. No, but I am concerned about it, because we may not know the true impact until
The third
August
Friday
or
count.
September, at which point it's very difficult for us to react.
Right.
Right. I think
Right.
that's the point you think we're...
Thank you.
Okay, so that is at least our first look. And this obviously will stay on the agenda throughout the budget process, and there's much more to come on this. I'll pause here.
Yeah.
Yes, James.
One other point that I would like to make is that all the questions about budget, but with being a non-instrumentality, we essentially have no say-so over anything that they do for the most part. That would be correct. Right?
I believe that to be true, yes.
So,
Yes. They answer to their board and to their authorizer, not to MMSD. So with that in mind, we created this sort of updated budget model with an updated pie chart. And I want to emphasize that this pie chart is more sort of pictorial than it is actual, because we have decisions to make that are not yet developed. What we wanted to do was show you at least a reasonable range of estimate on what a 2X charter impact could be. This has, again, heavy discounting on it. This could be plus or minus 50% one way or the other. We wanted to illustrate through that wedge that's shown in the pie chart that you will have to fit that cost or something like it into next year's budget. And that has impacts around the overall budget. So I think the impacts are something like these three items in combination. One, you're going to see an increase in expenditures from MMSD to make these payments. Dollar amount to be determined. Two, you're going to see MMSD attempting to do cost reduction where possible, again, on the theory, at least in aggregate, that you'll have fewer students. It's not necessarily going to line up step for step, and I've already made that point, so I won't carry on about it. Third, I think you could also see, in combination, some upward pressure on the local tax levy because of the conversion of private tuition to publicly paid independent public charter school. So that is the range of effects, and their relative weight is yet to be determined. So in terms of our overall modified budget model, most of these points that are shown here on the right, these parameters stay the same, except on the bottom, the last two bullets. You might be looking at a situation in April, May, or June where you're using more of your levy authority than you had anticipated under the simpler model, just because of the upward pressure. And secondly, you might see the tax levy begin to move upward too in response to those expenditures.
Mike?
Oh, Dean, yeah.
Yeah, the new charters TBD $1.5 million. Is that just a placehold number, or when you put the budget together by June, do you want to try to estimate, get more closer to an actual number? And if you do, I would consider anticipating high,
Right.
almost worst case, and then we can adjust later on if it's less. But I guess if we got an unknown expense and uncertainty around it, it'd probably best to anticipate that it would be almost the max, and then put that in there, and then in as the year plays out, it would be under budget, which would just give us some room to reallocate, I think. But it wouldn't serve us well to estimate low.
It never does. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So that's.
Can I just ask a question on the 1.5?
Oh, yeah.
The 1.5 is that an estimate of? So you kind of split this into new students into the district, right? So 275, some number of those would be non-MMSD students, and that will make, when we do our levy, that will literally give us more students that we're taxing for, right? And then some portion that are existing students. Is that 1.5 meant to represent just one portion of it? Because when I do the math, I get bigger numbers.
Sure. So
I just,
okay. So
to your point, like I'm getting bigger numbers when I do the math here.
Okay. So and I appreciate it. A couple things. You can do some pretty quick math and say, well, if the two 2X charters hit their enrollment goal of what would be 275 times 8,500, you're going to be well above our number. So here's what we've been attempting to model. Of those 275 students, how many of them are 4K versus not 4K? That number it's a big deal. Secondly, how many of those students are would be new in the enrollment count? How many of them would be transfers from within MMSD? How many of those students are residents of Madison versus residents of another school district, et cetera, et cetera? Again, early modeling, we thought that number of 1.5 million was at least a reasonable placeholder. But I'm super sensitive to giving that number too much weight at this point. I think give us another month, and we'll be able to show you our work, and let you decide how reasonable you think the estimate is.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So so that is the end of our first feature, of our double feature this evening, the monthly update on the big budget picture. We wanted to turn now to the preview of the school level staffing plan, which is traditionally our February topic. And for that, Lisa and I will tag team, and there'll be a cameo appearance by Deirdre part of the way through. So, Lisa, I will turn it over to you, but before I do that, I just want to say a thank you to all the people on the budget team and the teaching and learning team and the HR team who've been doing the school level staffing work. It's been extensive. Every deadline we had, they hit, and they did it well. So we're very pleased with where we're at.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the process that we've gone through, actually up until today, and I'm going to talk you through a little bit about what we've been doing, and I want to thank you for your efforts over the months to help us design and implement a class size policy that we have used to staff the workbooks, and we really believe that we have the strongest staffing plan yet moving forward. So we actually see this as a reflection of all the good input and feedback that you gave us over the past several months, so thank you for that. So familiar sight, here is our Board of Education approved class size policy. I'd just like to offer a few ideas to let you know how we use this to implement our staffing plan for the coming year. So a few key ideas. We staffed our workbooks based on the optimum class size that you see in the policy. We worked very hard to eliminate the high and the low end outliers within our plans. We addressed known areas where we knew there were some existing needs, and I'll talk to you about that in a couple slides from now. So we addressed some areas where we wanted to make improvement and where there were existing needs. And we also used an early in approach in a couple of different areas that we'll talk a little bit more about in the next several slides as well. And then we'll also summarize some process improvements that we are hoping set principals up for a better experience this year than before. So, overall staffing process and timeline.
Yeah, this is the other slide that we added over the last few days in case you're still downloading the earlier version of this presentation. I thought this might be helpful. Obviously, we're right in the middle of this work in the January, February piece of this graphic, the center circle. And that's all about determining the school staffing allocations, populating the workbooks, and getting that process moving. You're going to see now sort of a transition from the work being led primarily by Lisa's team and my team on the budget side to the HR team, sort of taking over the work beginning in late February, early March. That's the individual work with principals through their HR analyst and the chief reviews, and then the actual process of assigning individuals to individual assignments and so on. Deirdre, you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, I would only say that there's just a couple of kind of key dates. The workbooks obviously were released last week on the 15th. Those will be due back at the beginning of March, and that's really when our team kind of takes over. March through beginning of April, we'll be working closely with principals and staff to work through that surplus process and make sure that we get all folks kind of placed and allocated where they need to be. In the event that there's any type of layoff, you obviously will be briefed on that in early April, and then we'll move to go to what we call our mega post, which is our external posting that first week in April, and that's really then what kind of launches our peak hiring for teaching staff.
Thank you. So, here's the detail on this notion of early in. And we wanted to talk a little bit about this idea that we want early in on the workbooks with the new class size policy, and are happy to report that at K1, like we had talked about before, the area we really wanted to get after, at 18 or less is nearly universal in the workbooks right now, so we feel really good about that. Also, this early in notion in special education means that we went in up front. When you looked at the allocated and unallocated, we went more in up front on the allocated side. We scooped up more of those unallocated that we might have held in the past and put them in right now. And what that does actually in both situations, the early in at K1 and the early in at special ed, allows us to get schools more stable early on. It allows us to be more responsive, and it allows us to hire the right people with the right certifications sooner. So we think those three pieces were really foundational for our rationale around the early piece.
Just a quick question on last few years. There's been kind of a conscious philosophy of shifting from staffing with the ratios between SEAs and cross-categorical teachers. And I understand that SEAs are very often allocated based on, exact needs and things like that. But philosophically, where did this process fall? Was it an expansion of that shift? Was it a pullback from it? Was it kind of keeping things the same as they were last year?
So I'm going to get to this in the next slide.
There you go.
And I think
Okay.
we'll get to some of that, TJ.
Sounds good,
Yeah.
sounds good.
Yeah.
I didn't see it there, but
No, that's okay.
but it's
I'm
probably
gonna-
in your notes.
I'm going to give you some color commentary.
Okay.
So like I said, the earlier allocation promotes earlier assignment of staff and produces resource stability. Also, what we worked into each workbook was this idea of room to grow with space of about 5 to 7 students, knowing that that is not always accurate. It's also additional need that might come up. It isn't just numbers. So we gave each school some room to grow in their allocation. So it was a numbers-based way that we allocated. It was also, we know that schools have students in the referral process right now, and we looked at the sort of the percent of students that qualify when they're in referral and added that to allocation. And we also use a weighted formula for students that have some needs that might trigger additional allocation, medical needs or transportation or intensive support needs. To get to your question, TJ, sort of how that landed, let me take a stab at that. So on the numbers piece, the added allocation to allow for increase of students. What we did was we actually we used the same formula that we did last year. So cross-categorical teacher, for every cross-categorical teacher, there's this much SEA. There's also a flex pool that principals can use to convert to either teacher or SEA. And when we went in the all-in model, we took that all-in, that sort of extra room to grow, and we put it in the flex so that principals would have the flexibility to use those resources to convert to SE. They would have some local context upon which to use that to convert. We wanted to be sure that it was a numbers-based, it was about the little ones in referral and also the supplemental, and then when we went all in on top, we wanted schools to have the flexibility based on their own local context. Does that make sense?
It does, and so we really won't know till they make those decisions at this point. But that's fine,
And I will
that's a
say
good answer.
The workbook labs that occurred today, I listened to 3, I was eavesdropping on 3 of them today, and the consultation that I heard happening between John and his assistant directors and the principals were really positive and really healthy, and principals were seeing actual proof of this all in. They were talking about some specific needs that they have and how they wanted to address those. So we're hoping to continue to have those conversations and support them. One thing I do want to call out is, right, it would stand to reason that when you go all in on the front, you have less in on the back, right? I just want to be completely transparent. I also want to let you know that we want to assure you that we know that there are going to be needs that crop up. While principals will have to work and figure out sort of how they're going to be flexible with allocation, we also know there are some things you just can't predict, even with students that are already there. So we do have some allocation in advance, so to speak, out of IDEA. We always keep that. We would never go in with nothing on the back end. So just want to assure you that even though we have taken an all-in approach, we do have what we believe is a healthy approach to something else if additional needs might arise.
Nikki?
Quick question. Does this affect our maintenance of effort at all?
So, maintenance, we went into, that's a really good question, Nikki. So we went in on, so specifically around maintenance of effort, we went in with FTE and support similar to where we are more in the fall or right now. So we didn't pull back. Maintenance of effort, you have to have the same amount going in. So we went in actually with the same amount right now. We didn't reset everything. We're very conscious of that. I met with my federal grants manager about this actually, and she and I and Mike consulted on this process, this notion of all in and a little bit more in reserve.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
thanks
you.
for asking. There was some.
Mayor?
Oh, Dean?
Yeah, thanks. This sounds much more, well, it sounds very thoughtful and responsive to what we've been hearing. So I appreciate that. And I'm wondering one other thing. Do we have, can we watch this in a way with any kind of metric that can help us learn from the changes that we've made here. And can the group that we just hired, are they up and running yet? And do they have any tools that they can give us to track this, to see how this will work? This is a change, and it sounds like a good one, and it sounds like a smart one too. So good work. But can we do something also where we can learn from it quick to see how this happens? Is there anything like that we can build in with this new change?
So let me take a stab at it, and then Mike, if you want to add on where I might have missed something. So I do think we'll be collecting data on the way that the resources are used as a result of this new change, and then how that impacts requests moving forward, and what that looks like what the change is. You know, have we actually stabilized schools with this all-in approach? How does that look, and what kind of support do schools need? The project team that is working with ERS, when they join us, they're actually meeting. We're actually scheduling a meeting within the next couple of weeks to talk about this. But one of the points that we want to talk to ERS about is how do we gather and analyze data about how we use our resources. I think we've said before here, John and his team have multiple spreadsheets and multiple ways of putting all this data together that doesn't feel very efficient, and we'll be asking that group that we're working with for an efficient tool and process so that we can actually analyze how we are best using these resources. Mike, is there anything you would add?
Well, I think that, you know, we're doing a lot of work on the next iteration of the framework. We've been having these large discussions about where we should go and how we should comport ourselves. And one of the themes that came up was taking calculated risks. This is an example of us taking a calculated risk. We're putting more of our staffing resources into play early. The risk there is, well, you know, September, October, we could be caught with not quite as many reserves as we are used to, but it's a calculated risk in the service of schools and students. We have backup plans if we need them. I think it's a proper change in orientation. I think it's a good thing. How do we measure it? I think we have to pause in September, October and say, how did that work?
Right.
That's about as much as I. Yeah.
Well, hopefully you'll have a tool to help you look at it, other than say, what now?
Right.
You know,
right.
Because that's.
Look at that.
I don't think we've done it exactly unknown, but I think I just think we find ourselves in situations in October where we're scrambling as opposed to being more thoughtful. This way it seems like it's going to be more thoughtful.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So the next two slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's actually in the workbook. I'm going to give you some context around that. So some improvements included in the workbooks this year at the secondary level. At middle school, the staffing levels were aimed again at that optimum of 25 students per section in core areas. At the high school level, the staffing levels were aimed at optimal at 28, again, in core areas, with some extra attention paid to some of those outliers. And we know, according to our policy, there are some special reporting requirements that we are prepared to make as dictated in the policy. And then our staffing levels around the BEP, student services, and advanced learners, those are steady, those are the same, with any fluctuations occurring due to enrollment, not due to any adds or takeaways from the overall staffing levels. Also wanted to really celebrate and let you know about some improvements that we've included in the workbooks, where we've repurposed FTE to make the following things happen to address some specific needs. So we feel really good about improving access at the middle school to world language. We've been talking about this for a couple years, haven't we? About middle schools offering daily world language, offering more than one language, and we are supporting principals in some of our middle schools to do that, along with some changes in scheduling. So there are some middle schools who are ready to do that. We had an increase in students who are English language learners this year, and we had to increase some staffing allocation in response to that. I know you remember me talking earlier on about this notion of strings and the bridging allocation and this war of the tenths, so to speak, when it comes to and 1/10, and you get off and it needs to be adjusted, and you have a specials teachers who's 9/10 in one building and 1/10 in another. While we did not completely fix everything, we made some good progress on that, and Lori Fellons has worked really, really hard to bring some coherence to the bridging allocation. We are moving into our second year of the implementation of Pathways, and we have repurposed staff within our high school flex and unallocated to give them the coordination and the experiential learning support that they need. And then as ACP expands finally next year for grades 6 through 12, we have increased those high school FTE to support students as they develop their ACP plans moving forward, as I said, all the way in grades 6 through 12.
Both Pathways and ACP, does that mean that we won't see priority actions around FTEs in relation to this?
Correct.
Because last year there was kind of it was ambiguous about whether some of the ones we added a 0.2 last year, whether we were going to be asking another 0.2. So next we will not be seeing.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Good question. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk a little bit about year to year.
I'll just pop in for a second here. This is the overall view of the workbook staffing levels. Very similar total staffing levels compared to our current state. Just a very small variation there. You can see the elementaries and the middles, however, have a slight decrease, where the high schools have an increase. What's driving that is the enrollment forecast for elementaries and middle schools are down a bit, high schools up a bit. That's the number one factor. Second factor would be, in here is the allocation or distribution of special ed resources, which also move with specific student needs. Yeah, so this is, I was frankly a little nervous about this. With the new board class size policy, how would total workbook staffing come out? And would it be significantly more? And if so, how would that fit with the budget? I think the key to this is just better thinking around the outliers on the low and high ends allowed us to make the improvements that Lisa just described and come out of this basically with the same staffing resource that we have today.
So I want to outline just for a bit the process improvements. Every year we take feedback from our principals about how things went, and we implemented some of that feedback moving into the process this year. So our enrollment projections, we worked really hard to better break out the ELI, DLI classrooms per grade per school. That was a major lift for us this year. Really thinking about where those little ones are coming from, where they're enrolling, what the next grade is for them. And I want to really do a shout out to the RAD department for working with us so closely on that in our OMGE department. All of our principals are working off e-workbooks this year. We had 4 or 5 principals actually pilot those, play with those a little bit, give us some feedback. And I'm happy to say that all of those principals have access to electronic workbooks rather than Excel spreadsheets or paper copies this year. So we're really happy about that.
And that's middle and high school also?
Yep, middle and high school as well, you bet. We added a pre-planning phase for principals so that they could, in conjunction with their chiefs and their school improvement partners, really think about some things early on in December and January that would best reflect their lens of equity and their priorities for their school in the next year. We wanted them to just get started with some early thinking about how things could look, how things could change, do some collaborating and brainstorming and problem solving with their chiefs so that they didn't come to an unexpected sort of a workbook process without that pre-thinking. So we actually made that more intentional for principals to do that early on. We had our first ever new principals workbook orientation where we just targeted new principals, gave them a space and a place to ask questions and really dig into the nuts and bolts. And then we did our first all-principal virtual orientation meeting. All principals stayed in their building. We oriented them to the entire process. A real learning experience for me, thanks to TJ, our new Director of Instructional Technology. It was actually really cool. He kept all the questions in a chat space. We could answer them. People could ask questions anonymously or not. It was actually pretty cool. So we are learning from that, and we'll be asking, of course, for feedback on as well on that. But we think it better utilized principals' time and gave them an opportunity, very specifically with central office departments, to ask questions as well in a larger group environment while still staying in their buildings. So those were the process improvements that we think were important to make the experience more coherent for building principals.
Hey, Lise, given that it's 7 o'clock and we're 2 hours in, do you want to just touch on a couple things? I think the board can see some of the kind of examples later on. I'm not sure that we have to go over every single slide.
Want to click?
So I'm going to skip this slide altogether because we're going to show you a real, actual view of the WE workbook.
Yeah.
Teaching and learning guidance document. If you really want to get into the weeds on how we do staffing, it's the guidance document. It's what principals use to understand the rules. And just want to acknowledge that it's a ton of work by teaching and learning. They got it done, they got it on time, and it's very helpful. So I'm going to wrap up here with a brief example of what a school staffing e-workbook really looks like. And yeah, this is just, you know.
Okay, Mike, you have like a minute.
You're
really getting in the weeds here. Anyone
hopefully
can actually schedule an appointment and have a live demo anytime.
Here we go, Jefferson Middle School. They have a whole array of staffing options. They're given allocation from us. It's divided into categories. In this case, we're going to focus on grade 6, which is picked off of a menu. Once you get into grade 6, you have a series of choices. In this case, we're going to look at grade 6 language arts. When you click on that, it drops down to your staffing. The principal is picking off of the staffing list and assigning, in this case, Colleen, last name deleted, and assigning Colleen into 6th grade language arts. There's an automatic check on licensure and seniority that will tell you whether that person has the proper certification or not. Repeat, repeat, repeat. That's how it works. We allocate $250 million of staff this way. We need a tool like this to make that work. Done.
Thank you. Yeah, way better than the Excel spreadsheet.
Okay, Kate.
Excel is horrid.
Okay. I have 5 things. So I'm just going to run down them really briefly for each one. So 2 of them, all right, so 2 of the, so let me start with 2 ways that I would love to get some information for our next dialogue about the budget on how to create funds. I think so the first one, I'd love to just get some insight into how many rooms we expect to be under 15 this year. We had about 100 this current school year, and I'd love insight into what you expect next year. The potential action, I guess, there would be if some of our smaller schools were interested in exploring multi-age classes, that could be a way to create some more coherency at that optimal class size instead of at the kind of 11, 12s that we land on. I'm just interested in, A, are schools interested in it? B, how much funds would it potentially give us some flexibility for? So that's question 1. Question 2, same vein in terms of creating some funds. If we had schools interested in being whole school DLI instead of split, how much would that help with staffing in terms of bilingual versus not, smaller rooms versus not, bilingual staff? Again, are there any school communities that would be interested in exploring that? If so, how much, how many millions of dollars does that free up, if any? So those would be the 2 questions on freeing up funds. 3, in terms of I guess, how much kind of for priority actions. The first would be if we wanted to pilot full day 4K in some number of sites, one in each high school area, how much investment would that require in the coming year?
That's a good question.
Second, around expanding the Catholic Charities behavioral health partnership that we have pretty aggressively. What would that look like? And then the third one, and I don't want to derail this meeting, but I do kind of feel the need to address last week's in Florida, and
Yeah.
I think families have a right to expect that when they send their kids to schools here, we've done everything we possibly can to keep their kids safe. And we currently don't have internally locking doors on most of our buildings. I'd love to get an estimate of what that would be if we were to invest in that. It's the #1 recommendation from the Sandy Hook Commission. I think the quote is, I pulled it up actually because it's like the only thing in italics in the whole report. There's never been an event in which an active shooter breached a locked classroom door. So I'd love a quote on that, and any relevant training days, time, anything related to that. I don't want to take us too far off the budget topic, but just I'd love some insight into that for our next discussion. That was my 5 things. Done.
Okay.
Okay. Yep, thank you.
Right, this is really an information gathering and sharing meeting, so we're not really getting into a lot of discussion unless if there's questions people have or feedback on this. Yeah, Dean?
Yeah, the only thing that struck me when I read this yesterday and right after Kate just, I wasn't so certain around the maintained steady total staff levels for behavior ed, student services, and advanced learners. I'm not certain that we shouldn't change that by adding either with mental health services or with a community partner or other BEP staff and our own students. I'm not certain because of not just, wasn't just because of last week either. It's something I can't describe in more detail than that, just a feeling.
Dean, are you speaking specifically to the behavioral health in schools issue that
Well,
Kate is
that
mentioning, or not
and
necessarily?
BEP, I think they work together.
Okay, that's fair.
And so I'm not certain we're hitting it.
Yeah.
Hitting this as fully as we need to. And I have, and particularly, I asked a question yesterday that you can get to later, but you know, when we do a lot of screening, and then what happens with the results if we find something? And I think we all need to know that, and make sure that nothing's missed.
Yep.
So along those lines, I think
Yeah.
let's look at that with a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's a
You
set
don't have to
there's
argue
a
with
set of other
what
things that we
that's
should
on.
talk
Yeah.
about with that I don't think this is the right. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what we're with agendizing things, but
Yeah.
there's more there.
Yeah. Our next budget meeting will be on priority actions. I would put year 3, 4, and 5 into that category of discussion, and we've already been looking at the locks issue. So.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, any other, do you know, Anna, Nikki, James, Laura? Okay, we're on to the next agenda item. Thank you, Mike. Lisa?
Thank you.
Deirdre?
Thank you.
So it is the issue of land attachments and detachments.
Apologize, this map isn't as
Bless
a
you.
little dark, but I just want to orient everyone to the area we're talking about. So the area that has been petitioned to be detached from the Middleton Cross Plains Area School District and attached to Madison is this parcel right here. Okay? As a reference, we have Princeton Club here. There's the Beltline. So we're on the far west side of Madison. Just as, so I can stay on this map and kind of bring it all together. Oak Brook Corporation is the owner of that parcel, again right there. And Middleton has said they'd be glad to let that parcel go. However, they would like some property in exchange. What they're requesting in exchange is right here. It's the Homewood Suites. It's a hotel. And it is to the, it's not surrounded on all sides, but it is surrounded by Middleton Cross Plains around it. So if we were to detach that property and attach it to Middleton, it would not create a non-contiguous island. I'm going to move to, let's see, oh, did I go the wrong way, Barb? Yes, I did. Here, can that be moved up? There we go, thank you. This is a schematic and kind of gives you an idea of why Oak Brook Corporation is wanting to detach the property. They are almost finished, actually, with 2 apartment complexes. Right here and here, a road going right through the middle. Right here is the Middleton Cross Plains MMSD boundary. As you can see, it goes almost through the middle of this complex and through the tail end of this complex. Mm-hmm. They clearly don't want their apartment complexes in 2 different school districts. We'd probably have to parse out, you know, if a student lived here, where did they go to school, Middleton or Madison? These apartments are set for occupancy later in the summer, early fall, and they are, this isn't, I think there's a more detailed map that you can see in your packet, but they are a combination of 1-bedroom, studio, and 2-bedroom. Now, in terms of, so that's the basics. It's Middleton wanting to do a basic swap of property. To give you an idea of value, currently, if you were to go on Access Dane, the property that Oak Brook Corporation has petitioned to be detached from Middleton is valued at approximately $1.6 million. That's with no improvements, because that's a year ago's assessment. They estimate that the approximate value of the land to be detached once everything's completed will be $10,529,000. So that's their estimate of the value, again, of just this property right here. They value the entire property, so if we were to add this portion here that is in Middleton and this portion here, which is already in the MMSD, they value that at approximately $14 million total. But what we're talking about right now is just that approximately $10.5 million. The Homewood Suites, in comparison, is valued currently at $10,362,000. So it's not, it's pretty close to an even trade in terms of value. Actually, MMSD would, if you take Oak Brook's estimate of the value of that parcel, we would be coming out ahead by approximately $165,000. So in the grand scheme of things, a fairly even swap. This is consistent, this kind of land swap is consistent with the 1999 boundary agreement that we have that I come to you so often and talk about. It's that general sense of a swap for residential property for commercial property that we have done over time. Having said that, I do feel the need to point out, I don't know how many students we would acquire from this property. As I said, it's 1-bedrooms, probably not a lot of students there. Studios, not a lot of students there. 2-bedrooms, maybe students. So it remains to be seen what kind of enrollment increase we would get from acquiring that property. That's the basic facts. I open it up for discussion. One more point. Middleton is voting on this exact same thing on the exact same day, next week, the 26th. And I think they're looking for a sense, because obviously if we don't give them Homewood Suites, they won't give us this property right here. So that's kind of the essence of the deal there. So, any questions or?
If we were to do this, what school would any students attend?
Well, actually, you guys get to decide that. But I believe
What are adjacent?
I think it's Falk. I think we looked at, and it was Falk. But that's one thing. After we attach property, we come back to the board and say, where would you like this to go? But we did, as Mike and I looked at it, it would be makes sense to be a Falk territory.
And then there's, to the right, lower right there, there's, well, actually, where are the numbers 7012, that little rectangle there?
Yeah.
Can you tell me anything about that rectangle?
I think,
I mean, is that planned development? Is it?
No, I don't believe so. I'm not sure if that's a set-aside because of the roadway there, or I don't know that. I apologize.
There's not very much parking at that end.
Well, there is at the top.
Yeah, there's parking here
oh,
and here. But I do not know what that is. I know it's not a municipality boundary line. This is all one parcel here. So.
If it was platted for further development, if there was some kind of neighborhood plan that had been approved there for that, that would be good to know.
Okay, I can certainly find that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, any further questions?
I mean, I have no issues with the proposal, if that's helpful for guidance. So.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I was shorter than Mike.
I could say something to that, but I won't.
Thank you for your discretion.
Ouch.
Okay, well, that is our last agenda item. Is there a motion for adjournment?
Motion for adjournment.
Second?
Second.
One of us.
Laura, your advisory vote? Aye. All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting's adjourned.